Okay, thank you, Dr. Belkin, and thank you, Mindy, for putting this on. I'm so excited to be here and to talk to you all about the emerging therapies in multiple sclerosis and the road ahead. I'm going to stand a little to the side so I can see here too. All right, so to get started, we'll give an intro about MS. We'll also talk about some emerging therapies in multiple sclerosis, kind of what is a clinical trial, the mechanism of action of the drugs, the risks, the benefits, the status on approval, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So MS is a chronic neurodegenerative condition of the central nervous system or the brain and the spinal cord. Although many treatments are effective early in the stages of the disease, we know that early treatment is important and critical to managing disease activity. Before recently, there hasn't been much focus on research for progressive forms of the disease, including treatment of non-relapsing secondary progressive, and that's something that we're going to touch on today. So to start, what are the phases in a clinical trial and why does it matter? The drugs that we're going to talk about today, I'll kind of tell you the status on where they lie in these clinical trials and how close we are to approval. So what is phase 1 of a clinical trial? Phase 1 is the smallest amount of patients and it evaluates the safety of the drug. If the drug is determined to be safe, then we can move on to phase 2. In phase 2, we look at the effectiveness of the drug. So does the drug do what it's supposed to do and does it meet its primary endpoint? If the answer is yes, we can use more patients and move on to phase 3 of a clinical trial. Phase 3, we'll compare it to placebo or to the standard of care. The goal of this phase is to determine, is it more effective than what we currently have? If the answer is yes, then again, we can move on. And in this phase, we would move on to phase 4, which is real-life long-term monitoring. Okay, so now that we've reviewed that, let's get into the drugs. So the 5 drugs that I want to talk about are tolebrutinib, frexalimab, CAR T therapy. I'm going to probably butcher the way that you say this one, but I'm going to call it ibudilast, and then PIPE 307. I have a picture here of T cells and B cells, which are 2 important cells of the immune system. And as you can see here, many of the different drugs are going to act on receptors on each of these individual cells. As we talk about the drugs more individually, I'll kind of tell you how they work and the mechanism of action. The first drug that I want to talk about is tolebrutinib. Tolebrutinib is a BTK inhibitor, or Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitor. The way that this drug works is by acting on B cells and microglia. Many of you have probably heard of B cells because some of our drugs right now are B cell depleters, or they decrease B cell counts. This drug works a little bit differently. Rather than totally depleting the cells, it's going to act on the activity of B cells. It's also going to act on a really small cell in the central nervous system called microglia. And the reason that that's so important, our microglia are felt to be responsible for the progressive part of MS, or that chronic smoldering inflammation. The inflammation that patients say, I'm getting worse, and the neurologist says, but your MRI is stable. That's where we talk about microglia. So this chronic smoldering inflammation that's going on. And the goal of tolebrutinib is that it can penetrate the brain and get to these small cells called microglia. Potential risks of tolebrutinib are liver enzyme elevations, and as a side effect would also be headaches. The benefit of tolebrutinib is that it targets the central nervous inflammation and slows disability progression. So let's get into the clinical trial. Tolebrutinib had a trial called Hercules. This study evaluated patients with non-relapsing secondary progressive MS. It found that tolebrutinib, compared to placebo, had a 31% reduction in confirmed disability progression at 6 months, which is a huge amount. Not only did it have a reduction in confirmed disability progression, but it also had confirmed disability improvement, meaning some patients got better with tolebrutinib compared to not. Double the amount of patients on tolebrutinib compared to placebo had improvement in their disability. This suggests that tolebrutinib may slow disability progression, and it really is the first drug of its kind, and it's so exciting to finally hopefully be able to have something that might help patients who have non-relapsing disease. So how close are we to tolebrutinib is the question that everyone wants to know. The answer is it's under priority review by the FDA right now, as it was designated a breakthrough therapy. The FDA is supposed to let us know by September of 2025 what will happen with this drug. But for right now, it's not currently available to the public, but hopefully we'll have more information in the fall. And I'm hopeful that it will be approved and be able to be given to patients. All right. So the next drug that I want to talk about, one more thing to add about tolebrutinib is it's a pill. Okay, next drug is frexalimab. This drug is an infusion therapy. It's a little bit different than some of the infusion therapies that we have right now. Rather than depleting or decreasing your white blood cell count, it's going to interfere with how the cells talk to each other. So it's a CD40 ligand and CD40, and again, it's affecting how they talk to each other without decreasing that white blood cell count. This drug is an infusion therapy. Potential risks would be nasopharyngitis or COVID-19, and a side effect would be headache. Something I want to add, though, about COVID-19, so while this was seen in the clinical trials, this phase 2 study was also happening during the COVID-19 pandemic, so it's not surprising that that would be a potential side effect seen given the time. The benefit of frexalimab is it reduces new enhancing lesions, and it was also found to decrease a protein called neurofilament light chain, which is thought to be a marker of neuronal cell damage and thought to be partially involved in the inflammatory activity in multiple sclerosis. So how close are we on frexalimab? Frexalimab is actually currently enrolling patients right now in phase 3 studies. Patients that are potential candidates would be patients with relapsing, remitting, and secondary progressive MS. And I think if you ever want more information on clinical trials, you can always go to clinicaltrials.gov to hear more information about the current trials that are enrolling. All right, the next drug I would like to talk about is CAR T therapy. This drug has been used for different cancers, and now they're looking at it in multiple sclerosis. The way that this drug works is they're going to take blood and specifically take your T cells. Then they're going to take them to a lab, and they're going to go ahead and modify them and make them different. Once they're done, they're going to come back, and they're going to put them back into your blood. And the point is that this time, they're going to act on CD19, which is a type of B cell, and kind of modify it. The goal of CAR T therapy is, rather than needing recurrent infusions over time, is that this could potentially be a one-time event that kind of resets your B cells per se. By doing this, potential risks would be kind of a pro-inflammatory cascade and potential neurotoxicity. And then the benefits would be, like I said, not needing redosing, and then halting disease progression and reducing MS relapses. So for how close are we to CAR T therapy? It's currently enrolling, but phase 1 trials. So kind of that first stage looking at safety, if you guys remember from earlier. All right, so the next drug, ibudilast, is a pill. It's a phosphodiesterase inhibitor that suppresses pro-inflammatory cells, so kind of turning down inflammation. This drug has risks of GI side effects, fatigue, and depression. And then the benefits of this drug are that it's neuroprotective and potentially slows brain atrophy. So where are we at with this drug? This drug actually already completed phase 2 trials, but from what I researched, I don't think they're enrolling for phase 3 at this time. I don't think it's started yet. Okay, so the drugs that I've talked about so far are all disease-modifying therapies. However, this drug is a little bit different. Rather than a disease-modifying therapy, the goal of this drug is remyelination or repair therapy. In order to talk about this, I kind of want to talk about what is demyelination, and I'm going to use an analogy. So I like to think of demyelination as if you have your iPhone charger and you look at the cord, what surrounds the wire is a rubber coating. When you have MS, that rubber coating is attacked. It's getting demyelinated. That means that wire is exposed, and it's like you have a short in the cord. It's not communicating the way that you want it to or the way that it should. Now, we have some neuroplasticity where in MS, or in all of us, we can potentially repair that on our own. However, in MS, it's impaired, and it's not being repaired as much as we would like. So that's where this drug comes into play. In order to myelinate, you need something called an oligodendrocyte. So oligodendrocytes make myelin. So this drug acts on a receptor called M1 on an oligodendrocyte precursor cell. And the goal of this drug is to change that oligodendrocyte precursor cell into a mature oligodendrocyte, which can then go and make myelin. So the hope of this drug is remyelination or repair, is my long-winded way of saying that. So potential risks of PIPE 307. No major safety signals have been reported at this time, so I don't have too much to address there. And then in terms of benefits, like I mentioned, the benefit would be remyelination or repair. So how close are we to this drug? This drug is currently in phase 2 trials, which are expected to be completed this year. And then hopefully we'd have more information after the trial is completed. All right, so those are the 5 drugs that I wanted to talk about today. I did get some questions via email, so I'll go ahead and start with those, and then we can open it up to see if anybody else has any additional questions. So the first question that I was asked is, do I have any news on biotin for remyelination? That's a great question. There was an initial study, I think it was on like 154 patients, and it was looking at high-dose biotin and confirmed disability improvement. The initial study looked good. It looked like some small amount, I think 12% of patients had some improvement in disability. However, they then went to replicate the study using a much larger subgroup of patients, over 600 patients, and they were not able to replicate the same findings. There was not any statistically significant confirmed disability improvement. There was another really small study, only of 5 patients, so I would take this one with a grain of salt, but in these 5 patients with progressive MS, they also gave high-dose biotin, and they found that these 5 patients had an increase in inflammatory activity. Again, not enough patients to make many conclusions, but at this time, there's not enough to suggest biotin as a potential remyelination for MS. The next question I got was, could ivermectin be helpful or harmful for MS? I've had this question a lot in clinic and obviously here again, and there's really just not data. There's no published, no randomized controlled trials that look at ivermectin or long-term ivermectin use, and particularly in MS. So I can't really say too much regarding that just because I don't have data to support it one way or the other. The next question is, what is the state of MS funding for research given the current federal administration? So on a federal administration standpoint, there has been some budget cuts in terms of research. However, with MS specifically, we don't just rely on the federal administration for research. We rely on the National MS Society, who actually donated $18 million to a multi-year research fund where they're supporting MS research, which is pretty amazing. And then in addition to the National MS Society, there's pharmaceutical companies that support research, private companies that support research. And then many studies are not just based in the United States, but it's a global effort. So I still think that there's plenty of ability to continue with MS research, and I wouldn't let that scare us too much. Okay, my last question is, should wine be eliminated? Probably a bit of an individualized decision. I don't think that wine necessarily has to be eliminated. However, chronic alcohol use is associated with neurodegeneration, so I do not recommend heavy alcohol use. But if you want my personal perspective, I think an occasional glass of wine is probably just fine. Everything in moderation. And that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions?
My question is about CRISPR, and I know that they are making great strides with other diseases with that technology, and do you have any idea how far out that might be for MS?
Unfortunately, I do not. I'm not familiar with any data specifically regarding that in multiple sclerosis. I'm sorry.
A recent study came out of the University of Iowa, one of their hospitals, regarding cancer treatment drugs and the use of high doses of vitamin C at the same time to improve their efficacy. Could you see that rolling over and relating to MS drugs, a possibility?
I have not looked into that before, but as you're getting my wheels turning, I'm just thinking about vitamin C and potentially, stimulation of the immune system. And obviously we know that MS is an immune mediated disease, and we don't want to stimulate the immune system too much. So I'm not sure that would translate, but I'm not familiar with any data. I'd have to look into it.
This came in through registration. Is there any progress on myelin repair?
So that was one of the drugs that we just talked about, that PIPE 307. That's a study that's looking specifically at myelin repair. And the studies are looking to complete this year. And then hopefully we'll be able to share the data on if those studies are promising and if they're going to hopefully expand to phase 3.
I just wanted to ask, who was your favorite patient? No, I'm just kidding. I wanted to ask about remyelinization. When you talk about that term, does that mean you're cured when you no longer have any holes in your myelin?
That's a good question. Obviously, that would be the dream, right? A cure for MS, I think, would be all of our hopes and dreams combined. With repair or remyelination therapy, it's not necessarily a cure because it's not treating the cause of MS or the start of the inflammation, but it's hopefully repairing the damage that's been done from the inflammation.
I have a question about the CAR T one. Is that where they are taking the cells and like changing them and reinfusing them kind of? Have they seen any major like anaphylaxis with that or rejection? Because I feel like that would have like a high risk for that.
So there has been some inflammatory cascade as a side effect. However, it's still in phase 1. So that's what this study is looking at, is safety. So I think there's only been a few patients, and I think they've also looked at progressive forms of MS. And so far it's been very well tolerated from a safety perspective. But that would be, I guess, a theoretical risk. It's kind of that infusion reaction, but so far it looks good.
I'm in a support group, and one of our members actually lives in the UK, and they were doing a study that took metformin and another antihistamine. And I know they had gone through phase 1 and 2. I know at least in the UK. Is that being done in the US, and is that something that's on the horizon for remyelination?
They are currently looking at metformin as remyelination in the UK, as you stated. I'm not familiar with any US trials looking at it, but it is something that's being researched. The data, they did look into mice models, which obviously doesn't always translate into humans, and the mice models did look good. So that's why they're looking at it now, and clemastine is the other medication they're using together, both of which are in the UK. And again, I'm not familiar with anything here, but clinicaltrials.gov would have more information.
Any further thoughts on findings for SPMS with fraxilimab?
Yes.
Probably not.
No, that's okay. I got it. So with frexalimab, they are currently enrolling patients in the phase 3 trial for secondary progressive MS or SPMS. So it's definitely a possibility, and some preliminary data that's been released from phase 2 does look reassuring. I'm hopeful that will be a possibility in the future too.
Of the 4 trials that you mentioned, actually 5 you mentioned, can you speak to whether or not MIND is enrolling for any of those and or inclusion criteria?
Yes, I can. So frexalimab is a trial that MIND is participating in, so for relapsing, remitting, and secondary progressive MS. And then the VISTA trial, which is PIPE 307, was also done at MIND. However, that study has completed enrollment. In terms of RRMS and SPMS and frexalimab for that trial, there's a really long list of inclusion and exclusion criteria. I think you can actually find more information on Sanofi Studies, their website. That's who sponsors the medication. So yeah, it's a long list. But if you ask, there is a research, if you went to MIND, there is a research coordinator who could go through the inclusion and exclusion criteria with you. And obviously your physician could potentially see if you would be a candidate.
Okay, thank you. Then we've got another question.
Of the 5,000 supplements that are out there, are there any that are medically proven to maybe support remyelination?
I'm not familiar with any specific supplements that are approved for remyelination. The tough thing about supplements is they're not always regulated, so it's hard to recommend one way or the other, but nothing that I'm familiar with.
I've been hearing about stem cell. Is that similar to the PIPE? No, which one is the replacement? Read my note.
The CAR T therapy is that?
Yeah, the replace, like the stem cell real.
It would be still a little bit different than CAR T therapy stem cell would be, but stem cell therapy basically looks at relapsing disease is what they use it for right now. I'm not as familiar with that. That's not something we do around here, but Cleveland Clinic is a kind of a local or close place that does do stem cell treatment.
With these studies, are they not double-blinded studies? They are. Okay, so patient don't know if they're getting sugar pill or the actual drug, right?
If it's a placebo drug, yes, but not all drugs are compared against placebo. Some drugs are compared against a pill. So, for example, that tolebrutinib study that I mentioned in relapsing remitting MS, that was compared against teriflunomide, also known as Aubagio.
Is stem cell therapy, I think we just had a question about that, something that you would recommend or see any benefits for MS patients?
I think in highly relapsing or highly active MS, there is definitely a role for stem cell therapy. Unfortunately, it usually requires a larger academic center such as Cleveland Clinic.
Have you heard of using Ocrevus for short-term use, like for 1 year only?
I would say that that's really individualized based on probably the patient and physician relationship. I don't know that I can answer that without knowing more information, but that's definitely something they could talk with their provider about. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me, Mindy.